In 2019, at a conference, Shanja Jha said that the right has spent the last 50 years creating our current circumstances, our current conditions. And they continued, good news. We are at the beginning of the next 50 years. Sidestepping some of that partisanship and realizing it's all of us, one could say that the industrialized world has spent the last 250 years creating our current global conditions. And we could continue by echoing Shanja, good news. We are at the beginning of the next 250 years. Looking at a colonized and colonizing faith tradition and the grim future that seems to await the Church Universal, we could say that the wedding of empire and the Jesus way has been watering down and abusing the message of Christ for the last 1,300 years. And we could again say, good news. We are at the beginning of the next 1,300 years. Every year, the first celebration of the church in the new calendar year is Epiphany. The word Epiphany means a manifestation. It means an intuitive grasp of reality through a striking event. Often, an epiphany is related to the divine one, a divine manifestation, an intuitive grasp of reality through a striking event that connects us somehow with the divine. In the youth theory of formation, there is this concept that when someone has a difficult season, a dark night of the soul, a long journey with depression, an illness that knocks them out for a period, maybe we could say a global illness that knocks us all out for a period, when we return from this struggle, we have an intuitive sense of what needs to be done. A manifestation, an intuitive grasp on reality, a sacred meeting with divinity that somehow gives us new insight into how to live and be in the world toward shared goals. The advice of the youth theory of formation is to keep an eye on those emergence moments and ride them. Epiphany, the first festival of the new year, a manifestation, an intuitive grasp of reality, a God-directed insight into the way forward. We've talked before about the Magi, about how they weren't just, three dudes on camels bringing gifts to a king because they, liked kings? We've talked about how it was a collective of wise and studied people, likely of multiple genders. They studied text and they watched the stars, and yes, I am sure they listened for that epiphany, that intuitive understanding of reality. When certain stars aligned, it signaled for them a striking event that connected them with the divine and told them something different was about to happen. We've talked in my years here, and I'm sure in years before that, I'm sure you've talked your whole lives about conditions in Bethlehem at the time that Jesus arrived and through his toddlerhood and through his whole life, that these were harsh conditions, that they were oppressive conditions. The people were oppressed by Rome. Rome was a warring and colonizing empire that dehumanized all but its elite rich, and certainly dehumanized the foreigners it ruled over. And the census that drove Jesus' family to Rome, or to Bethlehem, it's a key too. It tells us something. It tells us that Rome was preparing to increase taxes. And that, of course, is one form of oppression. But the reason Rome would increase taxes was to wage war, more colonization, more dehumanization of people groups. We know that there was unrest in Bethlehem, and we can guess, given the nature of Rome or the nature of any colonizing empire such as the one that we belong to, more taxes for military use were not good news for the surrounding world either. At this time, Persia and Russia were vying to some degree for control. So the Magi are watching the world, noticing that it is in this crevasse of despair between one oppressive empire and another. The Magi are watching the world in a collective dark night of the soul, as in the U theory of formation, and not unlike our world right now, with increasing wealth gaps, a raging pandemic, and climate change. The Magi are watching and saying, this can't work. There has to be another way. And they see the stars aligning, and they tell them that a different kind of king is coming. I can only assume that as or before they travel to Bethlehem to meet the new king, they would study the sacred text of the people they are going to. I can only assume they knew of the Psalms to the king. I can only assume they knew of the dreams of a king as described in Psalm 72, a king who is for justice, a king who is near the marginalized people, a king who lives out liberation, a king of mutual flourishing for all people. In this regional, collective, dark night of the soul, the Magi seek a different kind of empire, an empire that is not an empire at all, but a kinship of humanity. And they come to this child, and they kindle this little flame in a dark world. They encourage his parents. They celebrate and tend the little light with their material possessions, giving his family gold and frankincense and myrrh. And they listen. May they listen closely to the voice of the Eternal One as the Eternal One speaks into their dreams, sneaks into their dreams with an epiphany, an intuitive understanding of reality, that this little flicker of light in a world run by shadows needed to be protected, and that the Divine One was calling them to return home by a different road. A different road. At a conference in 2019, Sumner said, the right has spent the last 50 years creating our current conditions. And they continued, there's a different road. Good news, we are at the beginning of the next 50 years, including all of ourselves and not partisanship. One could say that the industrialized world has spent 250 years creating our current global conditions. And we could continue by saying, good news, there is a different road. We are at the beginning of the next 250 years. Looking at a colonizing faith tradition and the grim future that seems to await the Church Universal, we could say that the wedding of empire and the Jesus way has been watering down and abusing Christ's message for 1,300 years. And we could say, good news, there is a different road. We are at the beginning of the next 1,300 years. As Omicron rages, once again we find ourselves physically distanced and longing for social solidarity. As we wrapped up 2 years of quarantine, we begin to realize that it is time to return home, even if home is much different than we have ever known it. As climate change threatens our home, we begin to realize the way forward has to be by a different road than the one that we have traversed thus far. As people injured by churches search for care, kindness, and the Eternal One outside of the church walls, we begin to realize that the road forward is not the road that brought us here. There is a different way. Today is the first day of the next 50 years, of the next 250 years, of the next 1,300 years. We are in a global dark night of the soul. We are in a climate dark night of the soul in its fullest. Many of us find ourselves facing Omicron with new exhaustion, frustration, anxiety, sorrow. We are in a striking event that wants to give us an intuitive grasp of reality. The Eternal One is close. As Psalm 34:18 says, the Eternal One is close to our broken hearts and our crushed spirits. And they have wisdom and insight to share with us. This is a season ripe for Epiphany. And so I want to invite us to pore over Psalm 72 this week. I want to invite us to make Matthew 2, 1 through 12, a guide into prayer this week. Having been warned, they returned home by a different road. As we begin this moment, this week, this month, this year, this decade, this 50 years, this very breath, as we begin the next 50 years, the next 250 years, the next 1,300 years, the Eternal One is offering us an epiphany that we cannot return by the road we came. As the Magi longed for a different kind of king and kindled the light of the Christ child, we long for a different kind of kingdom and kindle the collective light of Christ among us. We will find home by a different road. The task this week, this moment, this year, this breath, the very serious task that I want all of us to do and engage deeply in daily is to listen for Spirit leading in dreams, in breaths, in shared wisdom to a road that will lead us to our true home, a kingdom full of liberating love, justice, radical welcome for the whole family of creation. Let us seek Epiphany together. Amen.